very much. I'd like first of all to thank the NZMEB for sponsoring this presentation. They run terrific exams with terrific examiners and a wonderful breadth of repertoire. Look at them. I also want to say that no animals were harmed in the making of this presentation, but many of the pieces that Ludwig is going to play have been chopped up. So sometimes there is fragment that you'll understand. Sometimes there are a whole lot of little bits that we've put together to give you a feeling of what the piece is like. And I'd like to advise you to watch the screens well, because there are some quick changes of slides. So, in his lecture, A Search for a Tradition, Lilburn talked of needing a living tradition of music created in this country, a music which will satisfy those parts of our being which cannot be satisfied by the music of other countries. And where is this music, he asks? There is none of any consequence. It is only the most tentative of beginnings. I and many others have been content to accept Lilburn's statement precisely because the works of our early composers have not been made available to us. The occasional limited edition went quickly out of print, and music then considered suitable for printing was primarily music that would sell to the popular market, songs for the parlour, music for the balls, heroic marches for times of war. But many manuscripts still exist, and these tell a very different story. We have also been happy to accept the common adage that Lilburn is the father of New Zealand music. But is this true? There have been at least 3 earlier composers who were given this sobriquet. How can the music world simply have forgotten them? All of them were keyboard players, not surprising since there have been pianos in New Zealand almost as long as there have been Europeans. And one of the earliest pianos was Elizabeth Mayer's Broadwood Square Grand, bought for her in Sydney by her parents as a dowry when she married a sea captain in 1827 and set up home in Pahia in the Bay of Islands. However, all immigrants from England were encouraged to bring not just the necessities of life, such as a coal range and one's working tools, but also something to give the flavour of home and to ameliorate a social life which could be lonely or grim in the colonies. Tables, chairs, they could be made easily. Here's plentiful wood in the forest, don't bother bringing them, bring a piano. There were enormous difficulties offloading pianos from the sailing ships. A horse might be harnessed to a cart and driven into the sea, horse complaining vigorously, and the piano then manhandled down the side of the ship, as like as not to be dropped in the sea in the process. Carts or bullock drays then carried them, often on unmade and boggy tracks, through almost impenetrable forest or up steep hillsides. One family sketched the journey of their piano through the forest on a bullock dray, through the bog where the well was, manhandled onto a sledge, a guide rope passed around a post at the house high up on a cliff, the piano then hauled up by the strongest of the company, while all others crossed their fingers to avoid its falling to be smashed at the bottom of the cliff, like their cuckoo clock and their wardrobe. Other pianos were rafted across rivers, or worse, laid across a canoe and paddled precariously over, and many were the accidents. One of the bends in Otago's Taieri River is known as Piano Corner to this day, marking where a precious piano went to a watery grave, nearly drowning its owner in the process. Once safely here, pianos were used not only as parlour instruments, but also for the many dances and the grander balls the early settlers and their government officials indulged in. Of the 6,000 pieces of music that I've found in various archives around New Zealand, over 4/5 has been dance music. A plethora of waltzes, handfuls of schottisches, piles of polkas, galops, mazurkas, bourrées, and, as war became a shadow in our lives, also hundreds of patriotic marches. The dance music was created in a prescribed format. It was to accompany particular dances. For instance, a grand waltz consisted actually of a set of 5 interwoven waltzes in contrasting keys. However, each had, in addition, a stylish and arresting introduction and finale where the composer was permitted some individuality. What was original, though, was the naming of these new waltzes. One of the things that concerned the Lilburn of some decades later was that our music should make us aware of the colour of the country, but we can be fairly clear that this concerned also our earliest composers, who proudly named their dances with New Zealand place names and drew beautiful colour pictures for the covers. New Zealand scenes and New Zealand plants. You've just heard a portion of one of these dances, Baron de Thierry's Waitemata Polka of around 1854 that Ludwig played at the start of his presentation. Other examples are the Dunedin Chimes Waltz, the Picton Schottische by Antonio Vanini, the cover complete with the view from the harbour, including an already well-established Picton jetty. The New Zealand Polka with 3 giant volcanoes towering over the cover. The Tui Waltz, the Southern Alps Schottische by Charles Bonington, with perhaps the most beautiful cover of all of them, a beautifully executed lithograph of the Hooker Glacier and Mount Cook. And the Nikau Waltz, the most famous of them all, which went through at least 16 reprints from 1904 to 1940. So, and I hear already recognition. So an awareness of the nature and individuality of their new country was already present. It was a short second step from here for these committed composers to begin writing pieces in which their music is used to describe actual scenes of this country. Walter Impert was active first in Auckland, then Wanganui, from the 1890s to the late 1930s, touring a great deal in his later life to play and to lecture on music, eventually accompanied by his son Kenneth, also a fine pianist. Here is his earliest extant composition, the Chimes, a charming and naive gavotte humoresque, composed in commemoration of the erection of the new clock and chimes in the tower of the Auckland Municipal Buildings, and according to Mr. Impert himself, being the first gavotte ever into which the chiming of bells had been inserted. Another thread of this presentation now entwines with this display of descriptive music. Charles Sykes, organist and teacher of music, may be the first of our prodigals, our bad boys, those musicians with convictions for various vices. We know little of Sykes other than that he became bankrupt in midlife and that he could be boisterous and obstreperous, having been ejected from a magistrate's court for railing against the police who he claimed had caused a friend's death. His music shows violent oppositions in manner, perhaps like his own character. The Pastoral. Bells. country dance. Thunder at a distance. Prayers. Still at a distance, more thunder. I have found a little more about Mr. J.C. Glyde of Camo, Whangarei, who was active in the early part of the 1900s, including various newspaper advertisements, running over quite a few years, advising that his piece, The Earthquake, could be bought from him on receipt of a postal note for 2 shillings and 1 penny. His piece was published in 1910 and shows obvious familiarity with this tumultuous phenomenon. The rumble of the approaching quake, the shouts, the fires breaking out. He was a real New Zealander reacting to the forces of nature around him. Chimes. Listen for the rumble of the approaching quake. The earthquake's coming. The bells ring. There are shouts. The fire brigades come out. They're ringing the fire bell. The fire brigade's coming. Hear the fire bells. They're all on the way. Think silent movies. The steamer's bells are ringing. The escape of the inhabitants. The bugle's going to call. The bugles. The troops are arriving. Noises in the distance. The troops are here, marching. was in 1910. However, I found a news item in a New Zealand Herald of 1912 claiming Mr. J.C. Glyde, a musician of Carmo where the springs are, has written a piece called The Earthquake, dedicated to the people of San Francisco. Sousa, whose band is able to simulate almost anything, is said to have promised to have his band play it someday. Good publicity. But yet more mileage and more money was to be made of this piece. From 1914 and through to at least 1925, large advertisements appeared regularly in various newspapers under the heading Rexona, displaying an engraving of a most presentable young man with very tidily clipped beard and this text: Mr. J.C. Glyde, the famous musician and composer of Carmo, North Auckland, New Zealand, is not only well known in his own country and in Australia, but is much thought of in America on account of his brilliant production, The Earthquake, written at the time of the great catastrophe in San Francisco. All who know Mr. Glyde well will read with interest his letter in praise of Rexona and laxotonic pills. Your Rexona ointment is the best that I have ever used to keep the hands and wrists soft and pliable. After severe piano practice, Rexona ointment relieves and strengthens the wrists and finger joints. When tired with too much teaching and study, I find that laxotonic pills soon relieve the depressed feeling that generally follows the hard application of study. Well, now we The third step in this development of national awareness comes with the composition of rather more advanced pieces, each with a certain individuality, such as George Moore's sassy Danse Rustique, published in 1896. Alas, I can find no information at all, except that he was probably born in the 1850s or 60s. He's the least remembered composer of this talk. The most memorable of our early composers, however, and the first of our musical child prodigies, was the famous Charles-Philippe Hippolyte, Baron de Thierry, born in 1793 while his parents, minor royalty, were fleeing revolutionary France. The family settled in England, and shortly thereafter young Charles became godson to the man who was to become Charles X of France. He was highly gifted on the harp, playing for royalty from an early age to considerable acclaim. Also from childhood, he was fascinated by tales of Captain Cook's explorations in the Pacific. When at Cambridge University in 1814, he met the chiefs Waikato and Hongihika, who had been brought to England to visit the king and help with the creation of a Maori English dictionary. De Thierry negotiated with Hongihika to buy 400,000 acres in the Hokianga for a load of muskets and shot, and the megalomaniacal belief that he could thus claim sovereignty over all the land to the north of Auckland. He sought means to raise an expedition to claim the country. Eventually, 13 years later, he managed it, and he did set sail. But on the way, he stopped for 10 years at Panama to make his fortune building a canal. But he lost his fortune, and he continued penniless. First to the Marquesas, where he proclaimed himself sovereign-in-chief of Nukuhiva, and thence to New Zealand, where after so much lapsed time, no one remembered his land purchase. He was allotted a mere 800 acres, of which he proclaimed himself sovereign chief. In the 1845 uprising, he lost this land. He lost his heart, his other belongings, all of them were torched, burnt to smithereens, and he escaped to Auckland, penniless and possessionless. To support himself, he turned to piano teaching and piano tuning. But, eager to invest in further madcap schemes, he set off with his sons to make a fortune in the Californian goldfields, which he didn't. Nevertheless, he did manage to live in such high society as New Zealand offered. He wrote and performed music for the government balls, and he had a staunch supporter in Governor Sir George Grey, who agreed that he had been hardly done by in the loss of his lands, and he offered him a retainer to write his memoirs. I suggest you look these up. They're in the Auckland Public Library Special Collections. His later music has moments of beauty and grandeur. Another of the diverse strands of our compositional history involves the lot of women in the early days of the country. Eliza Wilson was born in London to a musical family. Her father, Marmaduke Charles Wilson, was a composer himself. Annette was by all accounts a brilliant pianist and composer. She later styled herself Professor of Piano and Harmony and wrote a little tutor book, Stepping Stones in the Grammar of Music. At least 20 of her works were published, most in Britain. She and her father travelled to Wellington in the late 1870s and a decade later settled in Dunedin, where she and her many fine students gave quite a number of concerts, at least one consisting solely of her own compositions. For piano, there was the village mazurka, a lively tarantella, a sweet basseuse, a polka, gavotte, caprice and reverie, together with orchestral and band works, some of which had earlier been played before the Queen at Windsor Castle and at Crystal Palace. A woman privileged to have been able to live a life of music. A woman with a father, but no husband and no dependent children. Published in Dunedin, brings us to an intriguing incidental strand, that of the various lines of succession from musician to musician in the country at this time. Our early composers were not isolated phenomena, but, just like now, they studied with each other and reacted to each other's works. Bourré is dedicated to Benno Sherrick, a musician of Germanic extraction, living in New Zealand from the 1880s to the turn of the century when he shifted to Melbourne. Our newspapers let it be known that he was one of the finest pianists in the world. A most innovative entrepreneur, he was responsible for bringing out to New Zealand lots of famous touring artists, many of them his personal friends. His son Max was trained first by his parents, then sent to Leipzig for 3 years to study piano, composition and pedagogy. His sister Paula, a violinist, was given the same opportunities. Both returned to Dunedin to set up a teaching studio here. Now, this will be mildly interesting for you, but for me, this is a wildly exciting moment in my research. It's like an adoptee finding her parents. I've just found my own mother's piano teacher. I had known only that she studied in the 1920s and 30s with a man said to be Dunedin's finest teacher. I found his photo amongst my mother's papers, but no name on it. Though she was my first and formative piano teacher, I never heard my mother play either, as she had been stricken with multiple sclerosis. I know just that she had studied to a very high level. There was in our home a huge cabinet of Liszt and Chopin and Beethoven and Debussy that she had played in concert, along with a file of concert reviews. To find her teacher, I was quite overcome. Annette Wilson may have led a privileged life, but the lot of women in the 19th century in a country with few social services was often very hard. If you had a husband, you spent much of your life raising a large family. Emphasis on large. If your husband died, you had to marry another to provide the care that you and your family needed. And another. And another. If, like Alice Rowley, you lost a few along the way. A divorce, however, meant immediate loss of livelihood, status, reputation, and possibly propriety. Clara Algar came to New Zealand as a young child, and as a young woman was well known as a pianist and respected teacher of the piano who walked in high society. On the 4th of July, 1888, the Wellington Evening Post recounts, "A wedding was held yesterday at St. Paul's Church. The contracting parties were Mr. Albert Algar, chief cutter in the establishment of Thompson & Co., and Miss Clara Hoskins, the well-known teacher of music. The bride was dressed in white silk, trimmed with grebe." 5 children arrived quickly. The mother with the musical name, Clara, named her first son Haydn, and the second, Beethoven. And now things began to go wrong. In August 1898, Albert was arrested on a charge of using threatening language towards his wife. But just 3 years later, Clara was arrested, and Albert divorced her. The charge being that Clara was a victim of alcoholism and continually neglected her family. Now alone, with a large family and no means of support, she turned to alcohol for solace, and to one other dread form of income available to desperate women, selling her body. A couple of years later, she was convicted for habitual drunkenness and sentenced to 3 months' prison. Only a month after release, she was convicted of being on licensed premises during a prohibition order against her. Further fines and prison sentences followed regularly. Now, Truth, New Zealand's own seedy tabloid, started reporting as her life spiralled further downwards. In June 1908, it wrote, "Clara Algar made yet another appearance in court. She daintily gathered up her skirts and brushed by the stalwarts of law and order, who looked down on the ancient battler with an amused smile. Clara, who was a fallen genteel lady, is well educated and for a long time had a distinguished career in local musical circles. She assumed a mild, innocent air. It was related that she'd been discovered in an empty house in Tory Street, about to have illicit intercourse on some sacks. She was sentenced to 12 months' imprisonment with hard labour. But a year later, there were more convictions, 74 of them by 1910, when she was convicted as a habitual inebriate and received 6 more weeks in prison, and the order to spend 3 weeks in a Salvation Army home. But in 1912, Truth printed an even nastier account, headed, "Sad, squalid scenes of seamy life. Dirty, disgraceful, disgusting den of drink and debauchery." Sounds like Truth. Clara had trembled like an aspen leaf and begged for another chance. And from this point, her life began to turn around. Certainly the magistrates always showed respect and warmth in their dealings with her. Perhaps it was the help she was given at the Salvation Army home, or possibly her family took her home to New Plymouth to give her the security she needed, for somehow by 1914, just 2 years later, most of the accounts in the paper are of performances, of the publication of her poetry, and of a collaboration with a New Zealand poet, Alison Booth. Corona Vitae, Crown of Life, was reviewed by the Evening Post exactly 101 years ago. A satisfactory feature of the work, is that, in spite of its necessary sombre character, it is wholly free from morbid elements, and moreover, in the broadly constructed opening air, there is a certain dignity of phrase. This odd note is appended. Arranged for brass band, it should prove very effective. I find this piece extraordinarily moving, an expression of her fight with life and the agony of her experience. Afterward, her second son, Beethoven, ran away from home at the age of 13 and became both a decorated soldier in World War I, but also an all-black, whose mates called him Beat. He's been much in the news recently. Clara Algar became a prostitute. Alice Rowley, on the other hand, was a prodigy living in straitened circumstances who married to lift her position. Her mother died of typhoid when she was just 8 months old, and she was sent to live with her paternal grandmother and 4 aunts, all musical but poverty-stricken and frequently without income. Cold, hunger, and poor hearing were continual problems. Alice attended Christchurch Girls' High from the age of 7, the youngest pupil ever admitted. Sir George Grey took an interest in her compositions and arranged for a number of the teenage Alice's works to be published in London. In 1891, she began studying music at university. Just a year later, in secret, in a registry office, she married one Donald MacLean, a man 35 years her senior. Oddly, both were too scared to tell the family for 6 months. He took her to a sheep station near Ashburton, where she had 2 daughters. She studied by correspondence, taking personal lessons in Christchurch every 3 or 4 weeks, and qualified for her Musbach degree in 1900, aged 30, one of the first 2 music graduates from Canterbury University, and the first woman in New Zealand to get a Musbach, having supported her grandmother and 4 aunts in the meantime by dealing in music and giving piano lessons in Ashburton all the while. MacLean died in 1906, and just 2 years later she married in succession John Forrester, who was also a great deal older than her, and when he died, Walter Mackay, a man at last of her own age. Her music consists mostly of songs, more than 300 of them. The Canterbury Times had the following commentary to make on her music. The gift of musical composition is met rarely in women, yet when one is found so endowed, the results are convincing. Woman is an exponent rather than a creator of melody. Her interpretations are very human and consequently are very natural. It is her nature to make her surroundings joyous and glad, just as the sun dispenses warmth and happiness. The study of the theory of music consumes a great amount of time, and perhaps too few women can give the full attention required to become thoroughly efficient in theory as well as practice. So much for women. Let's return to the strands of musical lines of succession. Arthur Bath, pianist, organist, professor and examiner, born in London, an associate of and professor at the London Academy of Music and organist at Christ Church, Kensington, decided in 1881 to visit New Zealand to join his wife's relations. Working first as a teacher for the Dresden Piano School, he rapidly became known as conductor of the Dunedin Choral Society and Liedertafel and organist in Knox Church, a position he held until his death. He had 3 very musical daughters, Beatrice, Irene, and Ruby. At his death, first Beatrice Bath and then the younger 2 girls took up music teaching to help support the family. Their many pupils had so many successes that the touring examiners were to remark on the consistency of their style and suggested they set up their own school of music in the Bristol Piano Company's building. The Bath School of Music dominated the music teaching world of Dunedin for many decades. It was still a force when I arrived in Dunedin as a 9-year-old in the early 60s. Easton was one of Arthur Bath's early students. Born in Airdrie in Scotland, young Campbell travelled out to New Zealand with his father in 1882. One of Arthur Bath's early students, he graduated as a pianist and organist, and as well as teaching from 1893, he became a composer of some note, extant marches, songs, anthems, various piano works, in some of which he showed his considerable sense of humour. March Cantankerous is just as quarrelsome and perverse as its name might suggest. Produced in New Zealand was veering to the unusual and exciting, becoming recognised as something quite individual. Musicians began talking of the father of New Zealand music. After De Thierry, one of the earliest contenders to whom the epithet was applied was Jack Maughan Barnett. He had already a fine career in England, practising 5 to 7 hours a day, giving piano and organ recitals, composing, lecturing, but then his health broke down. Southern air was recommended, and he took a job as organist in Hobart. A trip around New Zealand with a comedian, however, decided him to move to Wellington. His compositions were thought to be in consummate good taste, and his performances were highly praised, particularly one in Napier, which he and Alfred Hill did together, reported in the newspaper as one of the most charming musical evenings ever spent. His enormous repertoire on the organ included all of the Bach works and most of the main repertoire for the instrument, and consequently he was often invited to draw up specifications for the new organs that were being ordered for the many churches springing up around the country. Naturally, he would be asked back to each to give the premiere recital also. He was a force to be reckoned with. John Thompson considered him as strengthening a city which, by possessing Robert Parker, Tallis Trimnell, Alfred Hill, and now himself, could claim to be the most musically cultivated in the whole colony. Berceuse is an earlier work, consummately written. Is representative of his powerful harmonic sense and his elegant compositional style. Music is getting fairly virtuoso here, and one of the contemporaneous masters of virtuosity was Maurice Léon Driver. His Caprice Brillante, published in 1905, is big music in the Lisztian style, virtuosity on a huge scale, piano writing with massive pizzazz and showmanship. It's music with brilliance and glitter, and also huge fun to play. This is just a taste of it.